Hello, I'm Andrew Davis of Durham University. I'm an analytical philosopher. I was also a primary teacher for some years and taught many children to read, or at least I hope I did. In 2012, I published an academic article with the entirely neutral sounding title, A Monstrous Regimen of Synthetic Phonics. At the end of 2013, I produced the Philosophy of Education Society's 20th Impact pamphlet. The Impact series is designed to apply philosophical reflection and critique to educational policy issues. My pamphlet was entitled To Read or Not to Read, Decoding Synthetic Phonics. It runs to about 12,000 words. It briefly attracted widespread media attention. It's freely available. Since publication, it has been downloaded many thousands of times. 2 years later, I collaborated with Julian Elliott, a colleague of mine, and Rod Nicholson in a book about dyslexia. And a full-length book at the end of 2017 called A Critique of Pure Teaching Methods and the Case of Synthetic Phonics. The title of today's session is Reading, a Philosophical Inquiry. Why investigate the nature of reading philosophically? What about the obvious and important empirical questions here? My answer: specific reading conceptions are assumed by advocates of specific pedagogies. These assumptions are not empirical, or at least not purely empirical. In this session, I want to highlight two examples of such conceptions. The first is the simple view of reading, assumed by synthetic phonics proponents. Synthetic phonics is mandated in England for all pupils in state schools. And at this point, for those who don't know, synthetic phonics involves linking sounds to letters and blending the sounds to create a composite sound that can represent a word. A, n, man. A second conceptual assumption about reading ties it tightly to decoding letter-sound correspondences and blending. Here, obtaining meaning from text without decoding is not reading, but guessing. Advocacy for particular approaches to the teaching of reading make philosophical assumptions about the character of reading itself. These are assumptions that couldn't be wholly supported with empirical evidence. That doesn't mean that such assumptions are necessarily wrong, but they do need support. I will touch on some empirical questions about reading in what follows, but my approach is predominantly conceptual. I first approach it via an examination of the so-called simple view of reading. It's sometimes described as a scientific theory. It's nothing of the kind. It's a conceptual claim, and a flawed one at that. We certainly don't need empirical evidence to grasp this point. First, I sketch the simple view of reading before raising several key questions about it. The simple view of reading says reading comprehension is decoding multiplied by listening comprehension. So we see that it involves two elements, decoding and listening comprehension. Ostensibly, these are distinct from each other. The two components, decoding and listening comprehension, are sometimes said to be interdependent. Scarborough's reading rope is often added to the simple view of reading. Here it is. It purports to show how the two components, decoding and listening comprehension, become inextricably entwined as pupils acquire a measure of reading maturity. However, the simple view of reading does assume that the two components are distinct from each other when children first begin to learn to read. They are thought to be independent from each other initially, before gradually becoming entwined. Anyhow, let's take an introductory look at each of the two components. So I offer initial characterizations before devoting some space to problematizing them. What is decoding then? Decoding is blending letter sounds. So here's some very simple or basic examples. M, a, n, man. F, I, n, thin. S, a, n, sun. And what is listening comprehension? Listening comprehension is the understanding of words heard in speech. So, for instance, the child understands when an adult says, "The sun is out," or "Don't ever look directly at the sun." Here's an example of how the simple view of reading is supposed to work. Child sees the text, S-U-N, in her reading book. She blends three sounds that she thinks go with each of the three letters S-U-N. She achieves the blend sun. She matches her blended sound with her experience and understanding of sun in the speech of others, her listening comprehension. Gough, Hoover and Peterson note, quote, "In his dotage, Milton wished to reread the Greek and Latin classics, but he was going blind. So he taught his daughters to decode Greek and Latin. They read the classics aloud while he listened to them. Between them there was reading comprehension." End of quote. The simple view of reading is only a model, but I show that even as a mere model it is dangerously simplistic. To do this, I explore some of the complexities of reading. First, a bit of history. Apologies to those who are familiar with all this. In England we had the National Literacy Strategy, 1997. Its approach to the teaching of reading was called Searchlights. It involved phonics, grammar clues, context including pictures, word shapes including analogies with known words. It wasn't precisely compulsory in primary schools at this time, but most felt a strong pressure to follow it. They feared that if their results were found wanting by Ofsted, their national literacy strategy practices would be heavily scrutinised. Moving forward a few years, we need to note a couple of policy events: the Torgerson Report, 2006, and the Rose Report, 2007. The Torgerson Report found that systematic phonics has a modest effect size, but that no one version of phonics, e.g. synthetic, was more effective than any other, e.g. analytic. Torgerson was a government-funded systematic review. Jim Rose was asked by the same government to present a report on the teaching of reading. Yet Rose took little or no notice of Torgerson. Rose strongly emphasised synthetic phonics. He justified it partly on the basis of the simple view of reading. Quote, "We see good reason to consider each of the two dimensions separately, decoding and listening comprehension. Both dimensions are essential to reading." He goes on, "Evidence suggests that word recognition processes and language comprehension processes are separable dimensions of reading." End of quote. However, Rose is wrong here to talk of evidence suggesting. I will demonstrate that word recognition and language comprehension processes are conceptually linked. Decoding and listening comprehension are not separable in the way the simple view of reading seems to assume. For sure, the simple view of reading is only offered as a model rather than as a finely tuned, rigorous scientific theory. So back to decoding. Decoding is thought by some to be testable with pseudo-words. Ect, osk, han. These are examples from the English Phonics Check sample materials. Guff and Tumner's 1986 paper is the classic source for the simple view of reading. Unsurprisingly, they talk about decoding. Quote, "Decoding means different things to different people. Some equate it with sounding out, others with context-free word recognition. Our position is closer to the latter, for we believe that sounding out is at most only a primitive form of decoding. We believe that the skilled decoder is exactly the reader who can read isolated words quickly, accurately, and silently." So, people's understanding of decoding varies. It can be restricted to letter-sound associations and blending. Guff and Tumner strongly emphasise letter-sound correspondence rules, but they actually use decoding more broadly to cover any access to pronunciation by attending to the written text. Hence, whole word recognition may be included. Many synthetic phonics adherents are deeply attached to the simple view of reading, but their notion of decoding is invariably restricted to blending sounds using letter-sound correspondences, and man. This is the decoding skill said to be assessed by the pseudo-word part of the phonics check. SP enthusiasts eschew any notion of recognising text items as wholes because they link this idea to whole word, look and say, and related approaches that they regard as misguided. Guff and Tumner talk of reading isolated words quickly. I think they are referring to decoding in the quotation I've just read. So is it right to think of words being decoded? I think not. In that case, what do we get from decoding? We get initial attempts at pronouncing the results of blending sounds. There can be more than one possibility, even with one-syllable words. Simple cases, HAS, might be pronounced to rhyme with gas, so has, or to rhyme with daz, so has, the S making a Z sound rather than the S sound on the end of gas. What is a word then? Here's a typical dictionary definition of word. a unit of language consisting of one or more spoken sounds or their written representation that functions as a principal carrier of meaning. Dictionary definitions are often contestable. They make conceptual assumptions that are not always explicit or afforded justification. That is certainly true here. The definition talks of words consisting of spoken sounds, or words consisting of the written representation of those spoken sounds. This is simply wrong, because, as I intend to show, words are abstract and linked to meaning. Let me spell out and justify this claim. The dictionary definition ignores the distance between a word per se and its physical expressions. Understood as abstractions, words are not only represented in speech and text. Other possibilities include sign language, Morse, and Braille. Word identity can survive significant changes in pronunciation and sometimes mispronunciation. Word identity can survive significant changes in spelling too. Standard spelling is relatively recent. Contemporary English features both British and American spelling. And the sound we hear when someone says a particular word in English may be identical to the sound heard when a non-English speaker utters a different word in another language. This next example is a touch tricky for me to say, but I'll do my very best. Here goes. A que es una mesa means here is a table in Spanish, and wait for it, a cow eats without a knife in Yiddish. Northerners pronounce grass with a short a as in at. Southerners use the same middle sound as in farm, so they say grass. Someone from the northeast of England may say Luke's book, yet a southerner says book. The phenomenon of homophones also counts against the claim that words consist of spoken sounds. Homophones are different words that, when spoken, can sound the same or very similar. There are lots of homophones in English. I'm concerned here with those homophones that are spelt differently. Prince and prince, find and find, mind and mind, wind and wind, and one of my favourites, colonel and colonel. So a word cannot be literally identical with a speech sound. Suppose a child asks the teacher how to spell a word that the teacher hears as or. The teacher realises that the child can already spell the word that should be written as or. Accordingly, she asks her pupil further questions about the context to determine whether she needs something made of wood used to move boats in water, rock from which metal might be extracted, or even the feeling her mother had when confronting her daughter's tidy bedroom. Now for the case of pause, 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 and pause. Imagine that PAWS is encountered out of context. Our reader blends the letter sounds to make what we hear when any one of the four words pause, 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 and pause is said. but our reader won't know which, unless she already recognises PAWS as text and links it with a word in her listening comprehension. Moving from a blended sound to full word recognition is quite a step. Our reader is likely to need a sentence, or even several sentences, to provide a context, and or something non-verbal, dare I suggest a picture. She must be able to discover at least some of the meanings of the words represented in these 10 sentences that are contexts. She must know and understand a good stock of vocabulary in order to determine with which of pause, pause, pause and pause she is dealing. There are homophones in French. There, green, there, glass, there, worm, there, towards, and there, some kind of fur. And there are homophones in other languages too. They include Japanese, Chinese, Hindi, Russian, and Korean. In Mandarin Chinese, many different characters with different meanings have identical pronunciations. There are homophones in German too, but not nearly as many as there are in English. So, words are not literally identical with sounds heard in speech. We cannot literally identify a word with a piece of text either. Why not? Heteronyms are one of the reasons, where the same text can be pronounced in more than one way to say different words. I don't want to live for a century. Live music is so much better than a recording. I want to tear the book. She shed a tear. She only had a minute to put on her minute brooch before going out. The invalid made an invalid chess move. What happens when a letter sequence involves a heteronym? What must the reader do? Well, she must be able to identify which word it represents before she can pronounce it. A reader encounters BASS as a piece of written text in a sentence. She attempts to blend these letter sounds. She could, at least in theory, produce 3 possible blends as a result. The first shares a sound with farm, bass. The second with gas, bass. The third with face, bass. She cannot match the first result, bass, with anything in her listening comprehension, so she dismisses that one. She must choose between the second, bass, rhyming with gas, and the third blend, bass, rhyming with bass. Imagine that the sentence with which she is dealing is, the double bass player sometimes wished she had learned the piccolo. Her second result would have been a kind of fish, making no sense in this context. Hence, she decides that her third blend is appropriate. She can use this one to talk about a musical instrument. Let's think a little about grammar and pronunciation and special heteronyms. Often, the reader needs to use the context of a particular text item to determine its grammatical function. Only then can she decide how to pronounce it. Many common examples include use. This rhymes with loose when a noun. Use. It rhymes with yews when a verb. Use. And sometimes which syllable to emphasize in a word depends on its grammatical function. Digest as a noun is to do with the summary of some content. A digest of the research from UCL on coronavirus. As a verb, digest, it relates to what hopefully takes place in my stomach after a meal. Here, once more, the reader must ascend from first decoding attempts to the level of words and meaning. She often needs context to make links between her decoding attempts and her existing listening comprehension. Only then can she make a decision about how to pronounce the text that she has, up to this point, decoded incompletely. Some more examples. Protest, protest. Abstract, abstract. Transfer, transfer. Torment, torment. Pervert, pervert. Transport, transport. Fragment, fragment. Contrast, contrast. Permit, permit. This is a very common situation, and hence is an integral part of reading for meaning. There are heteronyms in other languages. In Arabic, all three-letter words. They are common in Persian and Hebrew, and many Chinese characters. Examples of heteronyms are rarer in many European languages, but they're not unknown. So as I say, many Chinese characters are heteronyms. Each of the characters concerned can be pronounced in more than one way, and each of these represents a different word. And what about reading without pronunciation? Someone born deaf may well have a good concept of a word without any link to a sound. I can't prove that, but it seems plausible enough. Even readers who aren't hearing impaired may manage this. I could read and understand some words before I had any idea how to pronounce them. I am certainly not alone. Now let's consider listening comprehension. A reminder, according to the simple view of reading, reading comprehension is the product of decoding and listening comprehension. I now show that listening comprehension is complex and very much a matter of degree. So what about this understanding someone has when she hears examples of her own language? Consider "put your coat on," said to a toddler as parent holds out the coat to the child. Suppose that the child has already seen the parent don their own coat. The child knows that it is pouring with rain. So, coat may well be in the child's listening comprehension up to a point. The child understands the meaning and role of coat in her parent's speech. But what if such understanding were restricted to that specific parental request? We might hesitate to credit the child with listening comprehension of coat. What would count towards full inclusion in the child's listening comprehension of coat? The child would be capable of a similar grasp of an indefinite number of possible utterances that featured coat. So, listening comprehension needs further elaboration. It extends beyond individual words. It must incorporate an appreciation of syntactical rules and conventions. This will be a matter of degree. Coat, for instance, can function as a noun, a verb, and an adjective. I'll get my coat. You've broken the coat hanger, and you need to coat that wood with varnish. Suppose a child's listening comprehension included back. Back can feature as verb, noun, adjective, or adverb. We can readily imagine a toddler having back in her listening comprehension, but with a grammatical role restricted to noun function, only later extending her grasp to cover a broader range of syntactical functioning. Suppose a child hears, "There came a white hart running into the hall with a white brachet next to him, and 30 couples of black hounds came running after them." Apologies to experts out there, I'm not sure how to pronounce brachet. Brachet? Anyhow, our child probably has never heard brachet or brachet before. She may nevertheless understand that a brachet is an animal of some kind, especially if she knows the word hart already. In any case, the black hounds reference strongly points to this conclusion. So she has some comprehension of brachet, but it will be severely limited, and much less than the comprehension she is likely to have of many of the other words here, such as running, white, and so on. She is likely to grasp their meaning without much help from context. These words will already be in her listening comprehension or speech vocabulary. If asked whether she knows what running means, she would give a positive answer, and yet. Consider for a moment this sentence. The temperature graph shows a 5-year running mean. In this context, she may not have the slightest idea of the meaning of running, even if she can uncover the meaning of the rest of this sentence. Listening comprehension isn't a simple, straightforward idea. It's not as if either what the child hears or produces after blending some sounds is in her listening comprehension, or that it isn't. Listening comprehension of any one word doesn't exist in a complete and clearly identifiable fashion when the child begins to learn to read. It isn't fully there, so to speak, in a form that can marry up with decoding over a period of time, because it has to develop over time in itself. The simple view of reading is explicitly a simple view, rather than a definitive and comprehensive characterization. Nevertheless, as boldly stated, it seems to be seriously misleading. It implies that decoding can be thought of independently from words with meaning and then combined with listening comprehension to supply reading. We've seen that this is not the case. Some supporters of the simple view of reading say that they concede all the points about interaction when looking at reading in practice. They say it's just a model and it's fine to train pupils to decode separately. I would have thought the basic points about the levels of interaction raise serious questions about that claim. I have argued that words are at a different level of conceptual abstraction from both of A, types of speech sounds, and B, letter sequences as represented on paper. Let's think a bit more about acoustic speech and physical text versus the abstract realm of meaning. Because inadequate grasp of the gulf between the two levels informs some flawed conceptions of reading itself. The character of speech sounds has no implications for meaning. The relationship is purely conventional. We cannot reason from the physical character of a speech sound or an inscription to anything to do with meaning, except perhaps for onomatopoeia. Phones and phonemes are two technical terms in linguistics. Their misuse has contributed to the failure to grasp the gulf between the physical character of a speech sound or of letters on paper on the one hand and words as linked to meanings, these in the realm of abstractions. Advocates of synthetic phonics often speak of grapheme-phoneme correspondences, or GPCs. This makes it sound as if phonemes are literally a type of sound, a kind of auditory atom into which the words we hear spoken can be segmented. Sounds which, when blended, can form words. Such sound blends would be datable physical events. These could, at least in theory, be measured and recorded with scientific equipment. I want to explain that this picture is seriously misleading. Let's start with phones, sounds conceived of acoustically. Speech can share sounds. Listen to someone saying the following three English words: farm, palm, and heart. You can hear the same sound in the middle of each word. We can hear a common middle sound when a speaker says should, will, and pull. Hearing dog, death, and disaster, we encounter the same initial sound. Stop, lip, and map have a final type of sound in common. The northerner says the word written as GRASS. She is likely to employ a middle sound that differs from that used by a southerner. Grass and grass. We're talking here about what is known in the trade as phones. These are kinds of sounds conceived of acoustically, those I have just outlined above. So the sound of the word NIP, as heard in speech, may be blended from three phones. N, I, P. The square brackets are used here in a conventional fashion to indicate phones. Phonemes, in contrast to phones, are at some distance from sounds conceived of acoustically. Whether a sound belongs to a particular phoneme is not primarily determined acoustically. The theoretical notion of the phoneme is certainly linked to sounds heard when any language is spoken. However, it is concerned in a very particular way with such sounds. It has to do with classes of sounds that, when altered, may change one word into another. Membership of these sound sets that comprise phonemes is not established acoustically. Let us now attempt to pin down the idea of the phoneme. Suppose someone says hat. The middle sound, or phone, may be represented by the symbol shown here. Now imagine that our speaker changes that middle sound and in consequence says heart. In English, the relevant phones are held to belong to distinct phonemes because of their roles in determining what word is being said. Exchanging a sound belonging to the set of sounds associated with one phoneme for a member of a set of sounds belonging to another phoneme may change the word we hear in speech. It does in our example here. Hat becomes heart. The two phonemes featured in the hat-heart example are represented by the symbols shown here. It is really important to notice that the criterion for whether a sound belongs to a phoneme class of sounds has to do with words as abstractions related to meaning. Whether a sound belongs to a particular phoneme is not primarily determined acoustically. Changing a sound may change the word we hear, but this does not always happen. Think about accent again. Fast and fast. In this case, the fact that one speaker uses a different middle sound from another does not change the word they are uttering. It just sounds different. The concept of a phoneme is abstract. It draws on the distinction between different words, abstract carriers of meaning, for its very definition. Accent is not the only factor in how the sounds associated with phonemes may vary. The initial sound, when the word top is heard, is not exactly the same as that within stop, yet the same phoneme features. The possible sound variants for a phoneme are known as allophones. Accordingly, such variants do not have the power to change the word in which they occur. In any case, no two speakers will pronounce sounds linked to a specific phoneme in exactly the same way. Phoneme identity is linked to the idea of a word, the latter taking us into the social realm of meaning. Phones and their identity conditions are basically outside that realm. The notion of a phoneme is relative to a particular language in virtue of its conceptual tie with meaning. For instance, in English, the difference between the sounds associated with S and SH is likely to be phonemic. I say the word sock. I alter the initial sound to sh. I am now saying the word shock. The change in sound has changed the word. Hence, in English, we are dealing with sounds associated with two phonemes here. Yet, in Japanese, the two sounds that English speakers associate with S and SH count as allophonic variants of the same phoneme. If I said a Japanese word using the sound linked to S, and then said something similar where the S sound was changed to SH, so S to sh, I would still be saying the same Japanese word. Now for reading and guessing. That second assumption made by adherents of synthetic phonics, that only using decoding to obtain meaning from text is to count as reading. Phonics adherents often accuse those departing from phonics orthodoxy of allowing or even encouraging pupils to guess rather than read. Now, no one would want to encourage or advocate young readers, young children, to guess. Not if guess implies stabbing around blindly and irrationally in search of the word. So there are some sensible but modest empirical points here about desirable habits. These include making intelligent use of letter-sound correspondences. There's the possibility of bad habits if pupils make random and thoughtless use of context. There is a history both to the antipathy and to the distorted use of guessing in these debates. It relates to so-called whole language approaches to reading. It is highlighted by the following quotation from Kenneth Goodman, quote, "Reading is a psycholinguistic guessing game. It involves an interaction between thought and language. Efficient reading does not result from precise perception and identification of all elements, but from skill in selecting the fewest, most productive cues necessary to produce guesses which are right the first time." End of quote. Are those favouring phonics trying to change the meaning of reading? Their new meaning would mean that a necessary condition for reading is that the individual concerned decodes text. It would imply that readers who do not blend letter sounds when trying to read some text are not reading. And this would be so even if they get the right result. So how should we respond? For sure, a reader might just be guessing when she doesn't blend letter sounds, but is she necessarily guessing? Suppose she reads the word, i.e. accesses its meaning, even though she can't pronounce it or would pronounce it incorrectly. I claim that guessing can be intelligent. Does reading take different forms at different stages of learning to read? Whole language protagonists such as Kenneth Goodman and Frank Smith believed that learning to read should resemble learning to speak. Christopher Winch takes whole language adherents to hold that reading is qualitatively the same from the earliest stages through to maturity, varying only in complexity. Others insist that early reading differs qualitatively from mature reading, that the initial phase involves a significant element of phonetic decoding. Beck and Beck, 2013, think like this, quote, "Proponents of various code emphasis approaches find it appropriate to engage beginning readers in behaviours that are not comparable to skill performance, such as systematic analysis of the relationship between written letters and their sounds in speech." End of quote. So are Goodman and Smith on the one hand and Beck on the other having an empirical dispute? Suppose we investigate a reasonable sized sample of readers. We discover what they're doing. We might learn that early readers do things differently from mature readers, and that early readers were doing the right kinds of decoding. Would such discoveries support phonics advocates and count against whole language adherents? But phonics supporters are likely to say that early readers should be decoding and only decoding. Mixed methods or multi-cueing approaches are said to be anathema. So this is not a straightforward empirical disagreement. Processes lacking decoding are called, in intentionally scathing tones, guessing. So how do we resolve this dispute about the very definition of reading? Here is my move on this point. Something like psycholinguistic guessing is often essential to the reading process. If reading involves uncovering the meaning of a text, let's return to pause, pause, pause and pause. Our early reader seeks to identify with which of pause, pause, pause and pause she is dealing. As we saw earlier, she examines the context, including the surrounding text, for semantic and grammatical clues. These will allow her to make an intelligent guess. To repeat, guessing can be intelligent. Her scanning will almost certainly involve her looking at the letters in other pieces of text in the relevant sentences. She will use her knowledge of letter sounds to help her read them too. The guessing process will be interactive and dynamic. Detailing all this may well make the process seem artificial and scarcely plausible. Needless to say, it happens very quickly, even with many early readers. The so-called guessing will allow her to home in on her word and finally reach a conclusion about which one it is. She cannot read PAWS for meaning without something like the above process taking place. Psycholinguistic guessing accompanies what can lead to reading tricky or difficult words. I'm talking about words with orthography of a kind that is not easily decoded. So are there different kinds of reading? There are perhaps some affinities between the concept of reading and the case of emotion. Emotions do not form a natural class. Analysis of psychological phenomena classed as emotions shows them to be not too unlike Wittgenstein's games. There is nothing in common to all of them, but rather a series of family resemblances. Read, in the everyday use of this term, may be similar. This would be in part because there are genuinely a number of different kinds of reading. We are familiar with at least some of these, such as skim reading, reading aloud, or even reading without meaning. Is it possible, as some mature readers claim, to read down the middle of the page? If so, the reader acquires a gestalt of whole paragraphs and absorbs the broad meaning very quickly. Grabe and Stoller discuss the range of legitimate reading purposes. These include reading to search for simple information and reading to skim, reading to learn from texts, reading to integrate information, write and critique tests, and reading for general comprehension. Different reading purposes need not imply wholly distinct reading processes. Indeed, any such implication would be pretty implausible. Nevertheless, a range of reading purposes at least hints at some variety in the reading processes concerned. Let's now look at a little bit of educational neuroscience research, whether they cast light on reading. Taylor and others, 2017, claim to have investigated two different ways of teaching reading. They make significant use of neuroscience. Note how I report their claim. They claim to have investigated ways of teaching reading, but have they? It depends what you mean by reading. Let's assume that reading involves getting meaning from text. I hope you think this a reasonable assumption. If so, these researchers haven't investigated ways of teaching reading at all. Let me explain. Our empirical researchers claim to have taught 24 English-speaking adults to read two sets of 24 novel words. These words were written in two artificial languages. The meanings of the words were said to be what they labelled or referred to. These were 6 fruit, vegetables, vehicles, animals, and tools, including axe, spanner, and camel. These things were shown in simple pictures. In one of the artificial languages, the training given to the adult victims focused on print sound mappings. This training was associated by the authors with phonics approaches to the teaching of reading. In the other artificial language, the adult victims were directed towards print meaning mappings. These were linked by our authors to balanced literacy methods of teaching reading. They believed that balanced literacy approaches emphasized whole word reading methods. These methods, in their view, don't focus on letter sound mappings or phonics. The artificial languages had simple and straightforward letter sound links, unlike English. The researchers made lots of references to two pathways in the brain: the ventral and dorsal pathways. The researchers identified the dorsal pathway in the brain as implicated when readers process letter sound associations, phonics, and the ventral pathway as implicated when readers focus on word meaning links, whole word, balanced literacy. They investigated whether the two training regimes were differentiated in their effects on activity in the dorsal and ventral pathways during the reading aloud and reading comprehension tasks. With the phonics group, how would dorsal activity reduce as the subjects became used to reading aloud the made-up words? How would such a reduction in activity compare with any reduction in the ventral pathway in the group using the print to meaning approach, the so-called balanced literacy method? It turned out that the ventral pathway was still active over a period of time when readers were engaged in the print meaning approach. In comparison, the dorsal pathway was less active once the readers had settled down with the letter sound association or phonics approach. So the brain had to make less effort, so to speak, once the phonics training had taken effect, in comparison with the print meaning training. Accordingly, the researchers concluded that print sound training, phonics, was superior to print meaning training, balanced literacy, whole word. So let's have a closer look at their conception of meaning. The meaning of axe was a tool represented by a picture. Consider the following bread and butter examples of sentences in which the word axe occurs. This axe is blunt. They wanted to axe Jim's section. She always has some axe to grind. They waited for the axe to fall. The rumour spread that an axe murderer was roaming the village. Only the first example seems reasonably close to how the authors of our papers see meaning. It is almost as if the authors subscribe to the Fido theory of meaning. This has long been the subject of derision in analytical philosophy, and rightly so. For the purposes of this research, axe just functions as a label for an axe out there in reality. Yet we have acts as a verb and as an adjective. Even when still a noun, it may not refer to a physical axe. You only said that because you have an axe to grind. Words frequently occur in idiom and metaphor. The way they mean then is a far cry from meaning conceptualized as mere labelling. Mere labelling is meaning in this research. Indexicals such as I, here, and now refer to people, places, and times, but they mean different people, places, and times depending on contexts. What about the it in "It is raining"? Words play various syntactical roles. Prepositions and adverbs, for instance, could not mean by referring to items. Moreover, much language is idiomatic or figurative. Familiar examples include bucket in "She kicked the bucket," or wolf in "Damien was a wolf in sheep's clothing." Reading a real language involves linking text on paper to words understood when heard in speech, listening comprehension. We saw earlier that listening comprehension involves the ability to recognize meaning in an increasingly large range of speech contexts. Now, such recognition invariably involves knowledge of empirical reality. John Searle ponders uses of cut in "Sam cut the grass," "Sam cut the cake," "Bill cut the cloth," and "I just cut my skin." The grass may be cut in various ways, but almost certainly not with a knife, while the cake will not be sliced with a lawnmower. We add distinctive meanings to cut as we read each sentence. To do so, we must draw on knowledge of the world. Hence, accessing meaning in this real sense would require activation of brain areas over and above those ventral pathways. One well-known neuroscientist comments, "Memory depends on several brain systems working in concert across many levels of neural organization." End of quote. So the meaning of meaning in the research I'm examining bears little relationship with meaning proper. It seems to be radically confused and dangerously simple. Moreover, the authors subscribe to a version of that simple view of reading. My researchers are well aware that they are investigating an explicitly artificial situation, quote, "a laboratory analogue of reading acquisition," end of quote. Psychology often does this. Yet here, the artificial restrictions in their investigations have led them to work with a wholly inappropriate notion of meaning. Some final remarks. Does it matter if the simple view of reading is oversimplified? Who cares? We just need to do empirical research to establish what works when we try to teach children to read. Stephen Gorard, a colleague, on hearing a version of this, suggested that it really didn't matter how simple or simplistic the simple view of reading is. Empirical research could demonstrate what works. What do you think of his comment? Thank you.